So welcome to our webinar, Measuring Effectiveness for Business Resilience. And Rocky, you can go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Excellent. Thank you, Rosa. And I will start. Share. And start. Perfect. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for spending some time with me today. We're going to be talking about measuring effectiveness for business resilience and security strategy to provide value to stakeholders. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Rocky Brockway. I'm the Director of Advisory Innovations here at Trusted Sec. I'm going to start here. I want to really just kind of start in a place where I actually tend to start. I've kind of touched upon this several times on several previous webinars, but I want to talk first and foremost about security programs and the organic nature of their growth, right? So basically growth, the growth and maturity of most security programs generally follows in the wake of the business, right? As the business grows, the security programs generally are trying to catch up and keep up with the growth of the business. But the natural kind of growth in this manner really kind of results in programs that generally are reactive and can be reactive for years at a time, right? In terms of how security is viewed within the organization, most organizations at this level, from an organic security program growth perspective, are still really looking at security from a profit center, right? And the reality is that security ultimately is tied to financial either losses or gains and things of that nature, and ultimately needs to be considered from the perspective of a cost center, right? So organically grown programs tend to focus in on many of the controls. A lot of the controls we'll actually be talking about today from an effectiveness perspective. But your usual suspects, right? The VPNs, the backup solutions, MFA, things of that nature. All of these are absolutely vital components to a security program, although we didn't start the fire. However, at a certain point, like I said, organizations really need to, understand and support that the protection of critical data is a function of business, right? And this is where business alignment really, really, becomes crucial. So just to kind of like set that stage first and foremost, part of what our job at Trusted Sec is from a strategic perspective is helping organizations get from kind of like that, organic program, almost getting around the brick wall, so to speak, to much more of a business aligned security program. And from a strategic perspective, we've found that this particular high-level strategy is a very, very easy kind of conversation to have with any organization, irrespective of how mature the organization is. And it really kind of boils down to these three primary pillars. The program maturity, right? So, here are the things that we're looking for you to have within your program itself. And then organizational effectiveness, which is really going to be, one of the focuses here of this webinar. But organizational effectiveness really is like, from my perspective, the easiest way to explain it is, well, it's neat that you have these things from a program maturity perspective, but how effectively have they actually been deployed within your environment, right? All environments are different, so there's going to be lots of different variables there. Then the third primary pillar is risk, right? Everything related to, and this is where, I'll kind of touch upon this in a second, but this is where a lot of that business alignment really, generally takes place. Looking at things from, okay, well, what's the likelihood of some of these bad things that potentially could happen to us? And then from the perspective of impact, right? The XY axis of likelihood and impact. If they were to happen, what would be the expected financial ramifications, right? And all of that then kind of like becomes, your security hamster wheel, so to speak, right? Rinse, repeat, focus on maturity, focus on effectiveness, focus on risk. Just to kind of get some just to kind of get some meat on these bones. And when I'm looking at maturity, right, these are the things that we like to look for in a security program. You can see governance, compliance. Compliance is a very interesting one. It's compliance ultimately is very, very close to maturity, but also shares aspects of effectiveness, right? And I'm going to be talking a little bit about expected effectiveness versus actual verified effectiveness. But I do like to, I was having a conversation with our managing director of advisory, Chris Cameo, and he's one of our absolute compliance gurus, and he kind of made the quote, and I'm not, this may not be quoted, but along the lines of like, look, maturity is really about protecting what you care about, where compliance is what a third party wants you to protect, wants you to do to protect what the third party cares about. I hope I didn't butcher that too much, Chris. If so, I apologize. But I thought that was a pretty, interesting and fun quote, just talking in terms of compliance itself. But, as we kind of walk down this list, our usual suspects, right? Policies, standards, data classification is a core component, which then really, helps feed into other aspects like vulnerability management, incident response, recovery, and things of that nature. Critical system mapping, a very overlooked aspect of maturity, mapping the actual, this is business impact analysis, right? What are our actual, critical systems, et cetera. Inventories are a huge foundational aspect. You can't protect, your organization if you don't know what's in it. Segmentation, backup architecture, which we'll actually talk about a little bit, et cetera, right? So you kind of get the idea. These are the things that, especially from a security consulting perspective, these are the things that Trusted Sec, is looking for in a security program on that maturity side. When we look at organizational effectiveness, then, again, this really kind of goes back to the whole, measuring your capabilities, right? And we can measure capabilities in a number of different ways. You see compliance audits are up there, right? So depending on if there's a compliance framework that an organization, needs to be compliant with, the actual audits themselves will result in what I would consider effective, or I'm sorry, expected effectiveness, right? Things like our attack path effectiveness, which I'll actually give a service update towards the end of this. Backup restoration testing, right? So have you actually gone through those exercises? How long does it take to restore your critical systems, right? Are they going to be available when you need them? All of those types of, again, measuring the capabilities and validation and whatnot. Segmentation testing and validation, all sorts of technical testing around, and especially the technical testing that is perhaps more defensive than anything else, right? The purple blue teams, our defensive validation and live fire exercises, all those are really geared towards measuring how effective your detective capabilities are, right? Which is a crucial element of any organization's security program. Phishing testing, how effective is our security awareness training, incident response tabletops, detection engineering, et cetera, right? So then, in our third pillar, this is where all of the risk assessment work kind of like, again, when I kind of step back and say, listen, how do we move an organization's security program from that, organically grown reactive program over to a much more business aligned program? This is where a lot of that work and communication really exists from my perspective, right? So looking at, the risk assessments, whether that's, whether looking at, we're utilizing specific frameworks, right? So the ISO 27005s and the NIST 830s. If we're looking at it from, a business risk assessment like Trusted Sec performs, where we're actually not only looking at, what are the critical systems, we're looking at the different threats and their capabilities, threat groups, and things of that nature. And then we're also then targeting the actual critical systems through technical testing, penetration testing, and whatnot, utilizing the attack techniques that are most commonly seen by groups that target specific different industries, right? And then looking at it from that, a little bit more detailed perspective around the likelihood and impact, right? Um, Impact analysis was really, one half in my brain. That's like one half of risk assessment. But then all of the program building and kind of like VC, so strategic roadmap guidance, all of these types of services are really intended to help organizations first and foremost prioritize, right? So, effectively communicating business needs and priorities to the technical team, right? So the business, here's our business model, here's our goals, et cetera, effectively communicating these things to the technical team so they can do their job, right? And then effectively communicating leadership risk tolerances and thresholds to the technical team. So there's, again, much more of a technical side understanding, to ensure that the business is being properly supported by the technical and security teams, controls, et cetera. Then the last aspect of these types of services and how they really really help us is kind of like that the reverse, right? So generally, our business leadership teams and boards generally don't speak technical, and generally our technical teams don't speak, business. So effectively being able to communicate, okay, we have technical priorities over here on the technical side, effectively communicating what those priorities are in a meaningful way to leadership to help them make the right decisions from a business perspective. And ultimately, those kind of like three aspects to me are really, what we like to focus in on from that risk side of the house, right? So then what's the big challenge here? Well, the big challenge is, all right, well, how do we go? Um, if how does an organization actually overcome this, what I've outlined from a security program organic growth challenge and begin better aligning with the business? And where I see and have seen I mean, I've been in information security over 3 decades now, where I see organizations very much kind of, um, I'll just say, not focus as much as they may, or maybe they should, is around effectiveness, right? So one way of measuring effectiveness, right? One of the ways that we really want to kind of utilize this is measuring effectiveness that then feeds the risk program, right? All this additional effectiveness data about how well these kind of tools, controls, and processes, et cetera, are actually functioning or expectedly functioning within your organization is valuable to decision makers, provided that we can frame it the right way and add additional value to, let's say, some of the general maturity type data that comes out of programs. Right? So effective. To be effective is achieving our desired outcome, and effectiveness, it's our, the actual capability or measurement of achieving our desired outcome. Well, what's our desired outcome? Ultimately, to detect and prevent attack techniques that lead to breaches of our systems, right? So when we kind of, take that definition and put it out of the way, like I mentioned earlier, there is this aspect of expected versus actual effectiveness. And expected effectiveness is, along the lines of, some examples are some of our attack path effectiveness assessments where we're looking at the tools in an environment and the attack techniques that they should be able to detect, and then looking at how well those tools and controls have actually been deployed. That gives us an expected kind of understanding of how well the organization should be able to detect let's say all of the known attack techniques in the MITRE attack framework, right? Actual effectiveness is, along the lines of, let's say, phishing testing and some of our adversary detection and our adversary detection and countermeasures measures work, right? So some of the purplish slash blue team services are actually looking at your SIMs and seeing, how well you're actually detecting specific attacks and how can we improve that detection and things of that nature, right? So we also have to kind of be cognizant of that, the difference between expected and actual effectiveness. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to feed into our risk analysis process, right? So Trusted Sec here uses, this is just a simple illustration from one of the original FAIR, one of the original FAIR, I think, documents. But basically, Trusted Sec uses a customized version of the factor analysis of information risk framework for our business risk assessments. And so you can see that, at the highest level, risk, is broken down into loss event frequency, which is likelihood, and then probable loss magnitude, which is impact. And if we look at probable loss magnitude, this is all about, again, kind of, your business impact analysis, understanding what the critical systems are, what happens if they're not available, things of that nature, right? Establishing expected financial loss criteria, right? Let's say this particular facility is, hit by ransomware and is unable to, unable to manufacture products for 2 weeks. What's that actually going to look like from a financial perspective? I did do a webinar last year on calculating business impact. If you'd like, some additional insight into that. But ultimately, impact analysis is our kind of right-hand side of the FAIR framework. The left-hand side of the FAIR framework is our likelihood, our loss event frequency. Now, within loss event frequency, we have vulnerability, and part of vulnerability is control strength. And this is where we're going to tie in a lot of our effectiveness stuff. There it is. So vulnerability, control strength, and when we look at controls, there's lots of different types of controls, that we can measure the actual strength of. Obviously, people in training, physical controls, endpoint and network controls, identity, infrastructure as a service type controls, backup, recovery, logging, monitoring, application development, response, etc. Right? Now, when we then look at how can we measure the effectiveness of these types of controls, for each of these, I'm just going to kind of like, do some cross-referencing here, but, measuring the effectiveness of, people and training controls, right? So we've got phishing testing, physical, clearly physical security assessments, but also red team exercises. Endpoint network, that's generally measured and, from an effectiveness perspective in terms of controls, via penetration testing and different types of red team exercises. Identity, we can look at Active Directory and Entra ID assessments. Infrastructure, we can look at, Microsoft 365 or any of those other types of cloud platform security assessments. Backup and recovery, our teams do a defensive backup infrastructure assessment, which is fantastic. Our teams also do, these adversary detection and countermeasures assessments, along with blue and purple teams to really look at the effectiveness of logging and monitoring. Application development, there's DevSecOps security assessments that we perform as well. And last but not least, obviously, from a response perspective, tabletop exercises. So I'm just going to kind of walk through just some examples here of some of the outputs, not all of them, but just a handful, right? So, measuring expected backup system effectiveness, right? So from our defensive backup infrastructure assessments, this is just a very small sample set of some of the things that we're looking at. But that's getting into the weeds, and then from an effectiveness perspective, we can get a really better idea in terms of our expected effectiveness of our backups, right? Actual effectiveness measurements around attack technique detection and prevention. Our adversary detection and countermeasures assessment, again, looks at how well the organization really should be able to, and you can see here the three kind of ratings that we work on, how well should the organization be able to detect, deflect, and deter different types of attacks. Um, in terms of measuring expected identity controls effectiveness, this is a sample of one of our cloud hardening reviews, looking at Entra. Again, a very, very small sample set of some of the things that we're looking at, but you know, getting deep and looking at that effectiveness, actual effectiveness around awareness training, right? Measuring that via spear phishing. Out of 20 emails, 5 were open, 5 links were clicked, and one person actually submitted credentials. So those types of effectiveness kind of engagements or just exercises, again, pretty valuable when we can again effectively communicate this type of data back up into leadership. Last but not least, our attack path effectiveness, like I kind of mentioned earlier. Um, this is all about, again, looking at an organization, and I'm going to kind of give a service update in a few more minutes, but the high level is really looking at all of the tools in an organization's security arsenal, mapping those to data sources, mapping those, then those mappings then give us kind of a best case scenario, right? You should be able to detect these attacks, but not those attacks based on the tools in your environment. But then really looking at a number of different effectiveness variables that I'll kind of detail further to get a better handle on how well those tools and controls have really been deployed in your environment. All of this is very, very, valuable, again, when we can effectively communicate it up into leadership, and whatnot. So, okay, cool. We've got effectiveness. How then can we tie that back to leadership? Um, and the way that we've found has been very, very good, has great results to kind of like being able to communicate this back to leadership is being able to apply a lot of these effectiveness kind of ratings of different, controls and tools and behaviors and trainings and things like that into the, what back to the FAIR model, right? Into our control strength, right? So control strength is really looking at, especially from a risk perspective, again, how if we can now apply how effectively these tools have been deployed into that more of a, let's say, traditional maturity kind of equation around control strength, now we're starting to really kind of, get into the weeds of being able to effectively communicate, what the organization's leadership team should really be concerned about, right? What is the actual likelihood of these things happening? And if they were to happen, what's the expected financial ramifications? All this kind of goes back to that whole aspect of being able to effectively communicate those technical priorities to leadership so that leadership can make the right business decisions, right? That's ultimately, one of the biggest goals in my mind, for any security program. So yeah, the strategy and business resilience aspect of all of this kind of just, again, very simply boils down to this simple strategy, which is looking at maturity and measuring, those things via, or not via, but, measuring those things that are in your environment to get more of a measured effectiveness kind of rating that then can feed better data from my perspective, better data into your risk assessment process that then is our kind of facility to communicate to the business side of our organizations. So that's kind of the high level there from a strategy perspective and why I feel effectiveness is a very, very, crucial component of any security strategy. What I want to do next is just kind of give a service update around our attack path effectiveness assessment. Um, we've been, we've had this type of assessment, this offering for it's got to be 7 years now, I believe. And it's proven to be very, very valuable for organizations and it's one of those things also that, many organizations don't really know that this is even a thing and that it's something that they should even be considering or even asking about. So I'll give you the high level, this much more of a review here than anything else. Our attack path effectiveness assessment is built, it's utilizing the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Um, and I'm guessing that the majority of the people tuning into this webinar know what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is. The high level for those that might not, it is essentially organizing all of the known attack techniques by tactic, right? So you can see that here, adversary in the middle is technically a parent. You can see that there are four children here associated with that. That'll be on the next slide though. And that is it is an attack or attack technique of the tactic credential access, which is hidden by the actual number there. I apologize. But, the tactics, initial access, execution, persistence, etc. Right? So, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, again, if I kind of let's dive into this adversary in the middle, as our example. There are four, child techniques here of adversary in the middle. The one that I'll pick on, which I just generally like to pick on, is LLM&R, our MBT, poisoning and SMB relay stuff. Which for good reason, right? It ends up being or has been a kind of a cornerstone of an attack technique for years and years. When you actually then kind of dive into the actual specific attack technique, you have your basic descriptions, right? So I'm sure this is nothing new to most people here. You can see that this particular attack technique is actually associated with two tactics: credential access and collection. The platform is Windows. It doesn't really exist on any other platform, et cetera, et cetera, right? But as you kind of begin looking at, additional details around this specific technique from the MITRE ATT&CK page, you will eventually get down to these, which are detections. So these detections here, the way the logic works is if you have tools in your environment that have visibility into these data source and data component pairs, then you should be able to detect this particular attack technique, right? And in this specific example, those data source and data component pairs are network traffic content, network traffic flow, service creation, and then Windows registry key modification. So if you have tools that have visibility into any of those essentially four pairs of detections, then on paper, you should be able to detect LLM&R. Oops, not bad. Um, so the trick here then is to basically now go through, and I'll show you some of this next slide is really just focused in on the data sources themselves, but you can see that there are 41 kind of data source groupings, right? But each of those groupings generally have, so Active Directory is one of those 41, but there are five additional, right? So Active Directory credential request, object access, object creation, object deletion, object modification. So, essentially what the goal for part of, I'll call it phase one of this type of assessment is to essentially look at every single tool in your security stack, right? And this is just an example. The next few screenshots are actually from our internal tool that we've built for specifically these types of engagements. So, taking the the actual inventory of your tools, and then mapping each of those tools to what data sources and data component pairs that they have visibility into, right? That ultimately gives us that best case scenario, right? That best case scenario is, okay, well, you have these tools, therefore you should be able to detect these 627 attack techniques, but not those 12 over there. And now we can begin to really kind of, on the one hand, why can't we detect those? What data sources and data component pairs, what detections are we missing from our tool stack? But also, we also, as a almost an ancillary benefit, we now also have the ability, once we've done this kind of mapping for each of the tools, to identify potential over redundancies, right? You may have five or six, tools that have visibility into the same data source and data component pairs. That might be an opportunity for, thinning out your tool set and reducing cost. But again, that's best case scenario. Where we want to go next is, all right, well, you have these tools. How effectively have they been deployed in your environment? And that's where we really get into these types of variables, right? So coverage, is this tool deployed everywhere that it should be? Are all the features enabled, that should be enabled in your environment? Availability, update timeliness, change control. Is it following, do changes to this tool's configuration follow a change control process, a CAB process? Do we have, skilled people that are owning and managing this? Do we have enough of those people? Things like that. All of these different types of variables then contribute to, expected effectiveness. And now we can apply those types of results back over to our actual, each of the individual attack techniques based on all the tools in your environment or in an organization's environment, um, and how effectively have those tools been deployed gets us, some very granular details like this. So this is just, looking at a subset of the credential access attack techniques and how well, this pseudo organization should be able to detect these different types of attack techniques. But also at a higher level, both at that coverage, just the coverage, right? So you have these tools, therefore you should be able to detect all these techniques. And then looking at it from breaking it down into, okay, well, your protective tools, are really good at this, but your detective tools, because of, whatever the variables happen to be that ended up being lower, maybe it's a new sim, and the teams aren't experienced with it or something like that. Um, but then, so being able to kind of like show protective effectiveness, detective effectiveness, and then maximum effectiveness, which basically is going to take, if I kind of back up here, it's going to take, for each individual attack technique, it's going to take the best score. So for our maximum, so it's not just taking, the better average here. It's actually going out, and you can see some deltas here in terms of like, well, why is that 385 when of the two averages between detective and protective, there's a 385, but why is that a 387? It's because it's actually going back down to the individual attack technique layer. So all of this is really, really great now for us to begin to, like I said, feed back into our risk assessment process that is going to help us better communicate up into leadership. One of the newer things that we have now within our tool here is this used to be a sprawl. Well, all of this used to be a couple of sprawling Excel spreadsheets, but the industry to groups calculator up until recently was still a sprawling Excel spreadsheet, and we've migrated that into our tool here for these types of assessments. What it gives us now is the ability to very, very easily say, okay, well, give me what are the most commonly seen attack techniques per tactic, right? So initial access, initial access here, privilege escalation here, lateral movement here, command and control. What are the most commonly seen attack techniques by groups that target your industry, or the organization that we're testing their industry. And not only that, here are the most commonly seen attack techniques, but also how do we fare in terms of effectiveness and being able to effectively detect, right, or potentially even prevent. But MITRE very detective heavy. How well should we be able to detect the most commonly seen attack techniques by these groups? And if we're, let's say, mediocre on some of these things, that's certainly an area that we need to then prioritize because you are likely going to see those attack techniques, just from the simple math perspective that, these are the most commonly seen techniques by groups that target your industry. So again, newer to our portal. We've been doing it for a bit, but now it's nice and pretty, and provides a lot of value here for us. Again, one of the things that I also like to really kind of illustrate here is this kind of like the attack path effectiveness assessment really, really complements a lot of the technical testing that our organization does, right? And one of the reasons to a certain degree, the analogy is, similar to a vulnerability scan and a pen test, right? A penetration test is only going to be able to actually test a handful-ish, right? But a handful of attack techniques out of the totality of attack techniques that are out there. Because they may be time-based or just, from a resource perspective, a general internal pen test is probably not going to, we're probably not going to see a 6-month internal pen test, maybe on the red team side, but generally not. So most technical testing can only test a small number of attack techniques by, on the vulnerability scanning analogy, by then, running, let's say, a vulnerability scanner following an internal pen test, that at least gives us additional insight on potentially exploitable vulnerabilities that weren't tested, right? This is very similar, and especially when we look at this from the perspective of pairing with those more defensive engagements, like the blue and purple team exercises. The attack path effectiveness assessment, given that any one of these types of testing assessments or engagements are only going to be able to, let's say, for example, I'll pick on a purple team, maybe only 10 techniques, will be walked through to ensure that all of the right logs are being sent to the SIM and those logs are correlated properly to detect these, let's say, 10 techniques. Well, what about the other totality of all the other techniques? This is why we've seen that the attack path effectiveness is very, very, it complements this testing very well because now we're also providing, okay, well, from an effective, I'm sorry, from an estimated effectiveness perspective, you also should be able to detect these fairly well, but not those very, very fairly well, right? Um, even though even though only 10 were actually tested, we're also now providing data across the entire spectrum of attack techniques and how well you should be able to detect those as, those as well. Okay, so that's that for the service update. And then, just very, very briefly, I'll wrap this up, and then if there are any questions, I can answer. We talked about our trusted security strategy, right? Our 3 pillars: maturity, effectiveness, risk. Effectiveness, I kind of defined effectiveness and the measurement of controls, the types of effectiveness assessments that are actually out there, right? So, there are maturity assessments, there are effectiveness type of assessments, and then there are risk slash what I call business alignment type, engagements and things of that nature. Again, all 3 of those, larger pillars are really what I like to focus on from a strategy perspective. And the additional telemetry of, let's say, for example, the, effectiveness results that come from a lot of these effectiveness assessments then we feed into our risk assessment process, which gives us, even higher fidelity data to really, kind of help again communicate technical priority to the business side, which again, those two areas generally don't speak the same language. So, helping us overcome that challenge as well. Um, Talked a bit about security and business alignment, right? All of that security and business alignment is business resilience. In my humble opinion there. And then we did the attack path effectiveness update. So if there are any questions, I am happy to answer anything. I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A panel. Um, so I'm happy to just kind of, if there are any other questions, I'm not sure if there's any chat stuff going on. No. So yeah, again, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any questions. I really appreciate everybody's time. And I hope you found some value in this webinar. And if there is, oops, let's see, let's get rid of that. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate the time. Oh, there's a question. Are there any tools that can help automate security tool testing? Um, so, so yeah, I mean, I know that there's a number of, especially around kind of like that. I wouldn't call it, any type of red team automation, but, there are tools like, Cobalt Strike. There's, I want to say Red Canary, I believe, has some stuff. I might be mixing up my tools here, but, a lot of those kind of like automated things you can basically chain different attacks together in some of these platforms that can help, essentially test specific tools, and especially around the detection, from your SIM and things of that nature, right? So throw this, series of chained attack techniques out, ensure that your tool is either, detecting or preventing, and then making sure that, the right logs are getting to the SIM for whatever SOC team to then correlate and then identify and then figure out whether it's, do we need to respond? Is this serious? Do we need to actually respond, or did our controls actually do their job and prevent those things? So I know that there's a lot of things that are out there. I apologize. I may have gotten some of the names wrong, but uh, there's another question here. I'm interested in learning more about opportunities for individuals who are new to cybersecurity. Could you please share if you do offer any we do, entry-level roles, mentorship initiatives designed specifically for recent graduates or those transitioning into cybersecurity? So the short answer is TrustedSec does have and I'm not sure if we're calling it an intern program. I believe we are. But TrustedSec does have a program now where essentially it is an immersion into cybersecurity and an immersion into TrustedSec, how TrustedSec, actually um, performs all of our different types of assessments, starting with, obviously penetration testing at more of that junior level. So yeah, we do have a program. If you can probably actually just go to our website. I don't have the specific details as part of this webinar, but you can probably just go to our website, and then if there's not actually linked information onto that yet, then you can probably just go to the contact Trusted Sec and ask there, and somebody can get back to you. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Again, thank you everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate everybody's time. And join us again next month for another webinar. Thanks, everybody. Take care.